Okay.
Yeah.
We're now
All right.
recording, so
I'm on.
watch your language.
What I say. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Alida Hass-Holcomb, and during the time that the presentation happens, if people would mute yourself, there will be time at the end for Q&A, and at that point, you'll be able to speak. But
Whoops. Wait a minute, Aletia. I muted you. I muted everybody, and it muted you as well. I'm so sorry. So you have to unmute. Good.
there, I think we're ready. So what I was saying that you may not have heard was that during the presentation, we're hoping that you'll mute yourself, but there will be time for questions and answers at the end, and you can actually speak to people. But what would be helpful to the presenters is if you would use the chat function and write out at least a little bit of what your question might be so that they can have a little bit of a heads up. So with that information, this is the Zoom for Cuba, the threat of a good example. And according to the World Wildlife Fund's Sustainable Development Index, the island of Cuba is the only country in the world with a sustainable model of development. I've been to Cuba once with Witness for Peace, and it's an awesome place, and I knew it was special then, and it still continues to be pretty special. A lot of people around the world applaud its good example, but the US government has for 60 years tried to destroy it by way of crippling economic blockade. So Pastors for Peace, which is IFCO, stands for Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, IFCO, has been taking caravans of people and humanitarian aid to Cuba for almost 30 years in open defiance of the blockade. So you're going to hear from two great folks this evening, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But before I do that, I want to share that this event is not sponsored by Oregon State University, but it is promoted as part of the OSU Beyond Earth Day celebration. So it's a statewide Oregon event, and there may be participants from around the world connected through the internet. So that's pretty awesome. And we hope that all the participants join us in acknowledging the debt owed to Indigenous people that have been displaced by colonist culture and commit to working for restoration of Indigenous rights. And with that introduction, I'm going to read the land acknowledgement that we use for that. Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampinafu Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are a part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. So I think that with that, we're going to go ahead and hear some great information from two people. Two people are John Waller, and the second person is Mike Beilstein. So I'm going to say a little bit about John first. John is a former primary health care administrator, originally from Sheffield, England. You might notice a little accent. He has a lifelong passionate commitment to social justice, both locally and internationally. And he has been active in solidarity with Cuba since 1991. First as a leading member of the British Cuba Solidarity Campaign. He is now a US citizen and has been involved in supporting the Pastors for Peace Caravan to Cuba for 20 years, for many of those years as the national coordinator of the caravan. And Mike is a retired research chemist in Corvallis, Oregon. He served for 12 years as a Corvallis city councilor. Mike works on peace, justice, and environmental issues through the Pacific Green Party, NAACP, and committees of correspondence for democracy and socialism. He has helped organize a Pastors for Peace Caravan support event in Corvallis every year since 1996. And he has visited Cuba 12 times with Pastors for Peace. So they both know a lot about it. And so we're going to get started. We're going to let our first speaker begin, and that's John. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Alita, for that introduction. I'm going to speak twice in this, relatively briefly at the beginning and at more length later. I know I recognize some faces. I know some of you have been on our caravan. Some of you are probably very knowledgeable about Cuba. I hope there are people on this who aren't knowledgeable about Cuba, and you're going to learn something today. So I'm really talking more to you than the most knowledgeable people. I'm going to start with something very personal about why I'm inspired by Cuba and why the US sees it as a threat. I grew up in England in the 50s. I grew up, and I'm going to talk about my childhood for a reason. I grew up in a country where in the 50s, for the first time, there was a national health service. Healthcare was free. I grew up in a country very different from what my parents had grown up in the interwar years. So free healthcare, free education, not just to 18. I was the first person in my whole extended family to ever go to college. And at that point, there was no tuition fees. And I received a grant coming from a poor family, which meant I could go to college and graduate from college with no debt. I grew up in a slum housing, but we got moved into public housing. Small, very small by today's standards, no hot running water, but decent, safe, secure. And I played in my street outside, less traffic in those days. No madmen, no pedophiles. I played happily. I walked to school as a 5-year-old, 10-minute walk to school, safely on my own. And we had enough food to eat. And that wasn't true. It had been for my parents in the 20s and 30s. We had enough to eat, but not like today where you go to the supermarket and there's 100 different varieties of cheese. When my mum told me to go around the corner to buy some cheese, I didn't have to ask which kind because there was just one. But we had enough. So that was the society I grew up in. In 1991, fast forwarding, as a health manager, I'd learned a lot about Cuba and its achievements in healthcare. But for the first time in 91, I heard a Cuban doctor speak about it in Sheffield, in my city. And he showed slides and he gave a great presentation. And at the end, he said, "Don't believe a word I've just said. I invite you all to come to Cuba and see for yourself." And a few of us decided, okay, let's do it. And we took a group of 22 health workers to Cuba in 1992. And that trip changed my life. And part of it is that it brought me back to my childhood. I saw a country that had a free national health service, similar in design with its primary care doctors to Britain, but with much less resources, they were doing it better, frankly. Free education, not just to 18, but you go to college for free. And if you go back to college as an adult, you have adult education for free. I saw in Cuba plenty of bad housing in Havana, and still is. It's not a problem they've cracked yet. But I also saw lots of new housing, basic, but decent, especially when we traveled to the rural areas. And I saw Cuban children in an in-school uniform and out of uniform, playing happily in the streets, going to school on their own, just like I did. And in general, my visits to Cuba, I saw people with enough to eat. Nothing like the choices that US people have, but they, for most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, enough to eat. And I thought, they're doing all this in a poor country, in the way that Britain did in a rich country. And that impressed me. But also I saw that this was under threat. The threat was particularly intense in 1992 when I first went to Cuba, because Cuba's trade deal with the Soviet Union collapsed. And after 30 years of US sanctions, which hadn't done too much damage, the US was moving in for the kill. But just going back to 61, in 1961, there was an internal document within the US government that basically said, Fidel Castro is popular. This is a problem. How do we get rid of him? And the answer was to create a system of economic sanctions, brutal economic sanctions, that would cause the Cuban people to suffer and if potentially starve and rise up to overthrow their government. 60 years on, we still have those sanctions. Sometimes more, sometimes less. In 2004, George W. Bush, his government, produced a plan for the future of Cuba. None of this let the Cuban people decide. They wrote the document. This is the plan for the future of Cuba. And in it, they said, amongst other things, many things, they said the National Health Service in Cuba must be privatized. The education system must be privatized. That was their future of Cuba. 2014, a chink of light. Obama starts a process of normalizing relations with Cuba by executive action. Some of us feel he could have gone further, but he did a fair number of things by executive action. And the risk was that what would the next president do? And we saw what the next president did. We saw Trump reverse virtually everything Obama did and more. And now we have President Biden, who campaigned on a promise not necessarily to undo everything that Trump did, but at least most of it. And 3 months on, he's not done anything about Cuba. That's my beginning statement. I'm going to now hand over to Mike, who's going to talk about sustainable Cuba.
Thank you, John. Anyway, Emily is going to queue up some slides that I have prepared for this. I'd like to say, just as an introduction, I first learned about Pastors for Peace in 1996 when Ed and June Hemmingson were going to Cuba with Pastors for Peace, and I helped organize an event for that. And then since then, I've been active with Pastors for Peace, at least organizing a local event in Corvallis. And I guess in 2006 was the first time I was able to visit Cuba, and it was a life-changing experience, and I've been back to Cuba a total of 12 times since then. But anyway, so I just got this clever title for this: what is Cuba's secret superpower? How do they achieve better than first world health and well-being statistics with a third world GDP? Emily, could you change this to slideshow so it's the, well, no, it's almost there. There, okay, so now we can just go through the slides. That's okay, so we're on the first slide. So anyway, so that's my experience. So I've had some interest in Cuba, so I read about Cuba, like other things. I read about climate change, and I read about healthcare issues, and but so I don't have any special academic knowledge about Cuba, but I have visited there 12 times. Anyway, I kind of like this cartoon, the one on the left. This shows the U.S. embargo, with Uncle Sam trying to strangle Cuba with the embargo, and then the little boat there says UN on it and lift the embargo. And every year, I don't know how long this has been going on, there's been a vote at the UN in the General Assembly to condemn the U.S. sanctions against Cuba. And it's always passed unanimously, except for the United States and Israel and one or two other countries that the United States can coerce or offer aid to provide. So that's what this cartoon represents. But somebody took this cartoon and photoshopped it, and so they changed it around. So it says, the little boat, it says democracy on it, and it says "Out of Cuba, tyrant," and shows Fidel Castro grabbing the island, saying, "This island is mine. Esta isla es mía." And so that, anyway, this is, I think one of these represents what's the real situation with Cuba, and I think the other represents what is a lot of propaganda coming out of the United States, especially from the Cuban exile community, which is supported, in this view, is supported by the United States government. So anyway, I think there's good reason why the people of Cuba, see the picture on the left is more representative. So Emily, let's see the next slide, please. And I wrote this out after I'd prepared all the other slides for this presentation, because I thought I might leave stuff out. And so I thought, just in case, I'd make sure I mention all this, and I'll read through it, although some of this is what John has already covered, and we'll cover more in the presentation, but I'm going to read it aloud and you can read it yourself, but just to make sure it gets covered here. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 introduced major policy initiatives to improve quality of life for all Cubans, and these included a literacy campaign that achieved 100% literacy in 3 years, tuition-free education from preschool to graduate school, free access to medical care, expanded healthcare resources through training of physicians and nurses, and a universal living wage. Now, that living wage also was capped, so for a long time, everybody in Cuba earned the same amount, which was equivalent to about $14 a month, US dollars. But anyway, this continuous economic and military interference from the US caused Cuba to become very reliant on the Soviet Union very early in the revolution. However, in 1989, the country was severely challenged by the collapse of the Soviet Union, which eliminated their major trading partners and the access to petroleum resources. The period of about a decade starting in 1990 is called the special period, when times were very tough in Cuba. And John has alluded to that already. During the special period, Cuba struggled to maintain the human gains of the revolution, and the US government tightened economic restrictions on Cuba in the 1990s in an attempt to topple the government. And fairly soon at the beginning of the special period, Pastors for Peace sponsored their first friendship caravan to Cuba in 1992. So I just wanted to have all this background in case I didn't mention any of this or it didn't get mentioned in the presentation. It's sure to be covered. So let's go on, Emily. And we're going to be talking about two concepts here. One of them is the ecological footprint, and the other, which we'll get to later, is the Sustainable Development Index. But I think most people have probably come across this concept of ecological footprint or carbon footprint, and it's an indication of how much impact you as an individual or you as a country or you as a city have on the world environment. And so it takes these factors like that are shown here: built up land, crop and forest land, and fishing grounds, and it kind of reduces this to a hectare or acre basis, so it could be compared from one group of people or one person to another person or one group to another. So next slide. Pardon me. So anyway, one of the applications of this is this concept of how many Earths do we need to support the lifestyles that we are now supporting. So, and so this shows by country, if everybody lived the way people in the United States lived, it would require 5 Earths to support that lifestyle. And of course, we don't have 5 Earths, we've only got 1. So it's just it's an indication of the profligate use of resources that's going on in most of the developed world. And these are the top countries for ecological footprint shown here, and you can see that in this list only India is using resources at a rate that's sustainable. So that's the next slide, Emily. This is a representation of that ecological footprint where they've shown a global map, and where the size of each country indicates the size of their ecological footprint. And so you can see China is really big, so they've got a big ecological footprint. The United States is big, and Western Europe. The colors indicate the per capita use of resources. So you can see that India, with a population of about 1 billion, is very big. And China, of course, is big because they've got both a big ecological footprint and a big per capita footprint. You can see most of Africa is, Africa is very small because Africa is used, relative to their population, is using very few resources. And the United States is, is big. Almost Canada almost disappears when you put the United States in. So anyway, if you've got questions about what this means, I guess we can bring it up in the Q&A at the end. But I hope you can understand this, that it's, some countries are using a lot of resources, sometimes because they have a big population, and the other countries are using very little. So let's go on to the next slide. So this is the other concept we want to talk about here is this Human Development Index. And this Human Development Index combines aspects of quality of life. And so there are 3 dimensions to it, as you can see across the top: long and healthy life, knowledge, that's, you know, access to education, and a decent standard of living. And a decent standard of living is determined in per capita gross national income, which for Cuba, this might be, they maybe score a bit low on this because the actual income of Cuba as a country and per capita is very low compared to what we would have in the United States. But they, you know, so, but even taking that into account, Cuba does pretty well on this Human Development Index. And I say that, you know, Cuba is not the, you know, according to these measures of ecological footprint, Cuba is not the most, doesn't have the smallest per capita footprint, and it doesn't have the best Human Development Index in the world. But the thing is, you know, they're doing things at a level that is considered sustainable. Let's go to the next slide, Emily. Thank you. So this is the chart, which is the kind of the center of the concept of what I want to talk about here. And what it shows is by country, it plots out the Human Development Index and the ecological footprint. So as you go across the bottom, it's an increasing quality of life or Human Development Index. And as you go up, it indicates the amount of resources that are used, the ecological footprint. And you can see it's got this curve where very poor countries that, you know, are on the bottom in general have a very, very poor quality of life. And the HDI, the Human Development Index, is low for them. But there's quite a variety even within that low level of resource use. There's still some countries do much better than others. I'd point out to this that Cuba is in the gold region in the lower right corner, which they have relatively low ecological footprint or small footprint, but they also have a fairly high quality of life, much better than some other countries that are actually have more resources than Cuba. And I guess, you know, if you're concerned about human development, the goal would be to get every country into that corner box there so that people have a decent quality of life and also are not wasting resources. I have a variant of this slide we'll put up next. And this shows some of the same information, but it shows it again by country, but it shows the trajectory. So the line in this indicates the change on this chart, which has happened between 1980 and 2007. And one of the good things about this is you see that almost every country that's represented on the map has moved towards a higher Human Development Index. You know, so that's in that 27-year period, and that's great. But some countries have made that transition at a great cost of resources, and the United States is the one to the at the far right at the top, which the United States is we've had big increases in quality of life in the last 27 years, but it's been a great cost to the environment. So Cuba is not represented on this at all, but maybe because it's too small, or maybe because they didn't have records from 80 to 2007 to be able to calculate the HDI. So let's go to the next slide. So then I want to go through some of the things which the Cuban Revolution has accomplished and why it's achieved this high Human Development Index. And so this is a slide which I picked up in Cuba when I was there in 2009. Oh, Emily, can we go back a slide? Yeah. Anyway, so I could probably find similar statistics for now, but this was from 2009. Anyway, and so just going through this, the average age of Cubans increased during that time because people lived longer. Life expectancy went from 62 to 78 years. The number of physicians skyrocketed in the country. So at the time of the revolution, there was one physician for every 1,000 persons. And in 2009, there's 150 per person, or 150 persons per physician. So much higher level of medical care was possible. Education was tremendously increased. The national budget for education went from 11 pesos per person per year to 680 pesos, so increased by 70 times or 60 times. Healthcare expenditures in the national government in 1959 was 3 pesos per person, and it went up to 639 pesos. So, you know, a 200-fold increase in expenditures. And half the people had no electricity at the time of the revolution. And in 2009, 4% still had no electricity, although actually I've seen data since then that as of 2019, 100% of Cuban homes have electricity. And of course, schooling was a big issue. So next slide, Emily. Thank you. This is something which, you know, you'll hear about more about in the program, but just this is you know, showing the deaths from COVID-19 by country. And this was as of last week. So in the world per million population, 382 deaths, but those deaths have been concentrated in some countries. Cuba, you'll notice, has a very low death from COVID-19, 43 per million, which I think translates to about to 400 deaths total in the country. I included on this, you know, just, I mean, well, I wanted to show that Cuba was doing very well. I included on the far right these Scandinavian countries because I thought this was very interesting that, you know, Scandinavia is, you know, is an area that's generally known for good social welfare programs and good access to healthcare. But Sweden is kind of the, you know, standout there. That's more like the rest of Europe. And that was because they adopted very early a policy of a laissez-faire policy towards COVID of achieving herd immunity as rapidly as possible by not trying to stop the infection from spreading. So that I just thought that was a curious standout there. Anyway, next slide, Emily. This is, you know, more about physicians in Cuba. Cuba, you know, probably has the most intense medical care anywhere in the world because they have so many physicians, and they, you know, and they not only have a lot of physicians in Cuba, but they are training physicians for a lot of Latin America and Africa as well. And John will probably bring up some about that, but just by comparison, that, you know, Cuba has 3 times the density of doctors that we have in the United States or Canada or Mexico. Next slide. And here's some stuff about energy use, and this is, well, interesting to me because of the concept of the special period and what happened to Cuba after 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you could see that, you know, this years leading up to 1989, it was fairly constant use of energy, but, you know, per capita in Cuba. It fell kind of precipitously and then got even lower towards the end of the special period. The first time I visited Cuba was in 2006, which on this graph is kind of the low point. But when I visited Cuba, there really wasn't a lot of concern about access to electricity at the time. And the reason is because, you know, part of their recovery program during the special period, the Cuban government made sure that people got modern, high efficiency electrical appliances. So things like cookware, rice cookers, and air conditioning and stuff was all in, well, at that time, compact fluorescent light bulbs. So they were using energy much more efficiently, and that was part of how they responded to the special period was, you know, if you have fewer resources, make sure you use them efficiently. Now, there's been recovery of energy use in Cuba after 2006, but it never came up to even to the levels that were used, you know, prior to the special period, which is of interest to me because it means that they didn't have to get back to the same level of resource use to still maintain a good quality of life. So the next slide. This is comparing per capita energy use in the United States and Cuba. If you look at this, it looks, rather than this drop that occurred in Cuba, it looks like Cuba is just flat at about 1/8 of the energy use in the United States. And people could say, well, using all that energy, we've got a better quality of life in the United States. We've got more freedom to travel, and and we can run more appliances in our home. But are we really living 8 times better than in Cuba because of having those resources, wasting those resources? So next slide, Emily. Well, it looks on my screen, the top of this is missing, but it's okay. But this is life expectancy in the United States and Cuba, and it shows that there was improvement in both the United States and Cuba, but since about 1970, the United States has matched Cuba for life expectancy. So if you take life expectancy as a major indicator of quality of life, then Cuba is doing as well as the United States. Next, Emily. And this child mortality rate is again, this shows that at one time, even early in the revolution, there was a high mortality rate, high child mortality rate in Cuba, but it came down very rapidly. And as of 2000, we actually have a worse child mortality rate in the United States than in Cuba. So it's so that those improvements have been made. And next, Emily. And I wanted to mention this about urban organic agriculture, that one thing any visitor to Cuba will notice: in every city in Cuba, there are large 2-acre fields in the middle of cities that provide produce for the surrounding people. And this picture is in Santa Clara, and this is the place I visited. But so you can see the high-rise apartment building is right across the road from this organic garden. So the organic garden supplies, direct sales to people in the high-rise apartment building, but they also supply food to institutions and other places that are providing communal food eating. So anyway, this program was actually developed and when I visited Cuba, people have attributed directly to Raul Castro, who was head of the army. And he developed this in the army basically to supply good quality food to people who were in the Cuban army. But in the 1980s, or during the 1990s, during the special period, this was brought out as a kind of an institution that was established throughout Cuba. And so Cuba, I think, as many of you know, has become a world leader in organic agriculture, and also in the concept of urban agriculture, to make sure that food is directly available to populations that need it. So next slide. I think this is the last slide, and this is just my conclusions, that this is what I believe, that Cuba achieved a very high quality of life for its citizens, as indicated by the Human Development Index, with minimal use of natural resources, that is a small ecological footprint, by concentrating on meeting human needs for all citizens fairly and equitably. And this is the result both of government policies, but also it's the culture that's been created by those government policies, where people have a sense of mutual responsibility. And so I think that's the secret of Cuba, is that it has a government that's working for the good of the people, not for the good of the investors. And its people, as a result, have picked up that spirit, and they care for each other. So that's the end of my presentation. And I think I'm going to send it back to John Waller. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Before we move on to some video material, I just wanted to say that I live in Seattle now, the home of Microsoft and Amazon. the home of Jeff Bezos, or at least the economic home of Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, and of Bill Gates, who was once the richest man in the world. And we think of, if I think of the money that they two people, individuals personally have, and how many problems in the world could be solved just by their own personal wealth. That's part of why I'm inspired by Cuba. Rather than have me and Mike just talking at you all night, we're now going to show you some video material, which includes Cuban experts speaking. It's taken from a recent program by Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman. And it's not the whole program, but it's about 15 minutes in two slots. So you're going to see a 4-minute slot. Then there's going to be a slight hiccup while Emily goes on to the next one. And then there's going to be a 11, 12-minute slot. And it's talking about Cuba now and about COVID. Okay, Emily? It's coming. There's no sound, Emily.
When you share a video, you have to click a special box at the bottom of the share screen to say that you're sharing sound.
Okay.
I can tell people we tried this before we started the meeting and got it to work.
It will work again.
Thank you for this presentation.
Hi, Malaya. Alita
Hi,
here.
Alita.
Good to see you.
Oops. What's going on?
Helps the audio to work.
Emily, did you mute yourself and maybe that's what's happening?
Emily, we can't hear anything. Could you try unmuting yourself?
That's obviously the problem. I'm really apologetic.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now! Democracy, 140 Cubans have died from COVID-19, giving the island one of the lowest death rates per capita in the world. Cuba's also developing 5 COVID-19 vaccines, including 2 which have entered stage 3 trials. Eduardo Martinez is the president of BioCuba Pharma.
We are very confident that our vaccines will be effective. The vaccines that are being developed, the results that we have had to date point to satisfactory results. And we maintain that before the end of 2021, our population will be immunized with the vaccines that we're developing. Given the blockade that we are subjected to and the situation in the country, it would have been very difficult for us to get the results that we are getting in the fight against the pandemic if we had not developed this industry more than 35 years ago in our country.
For decades, Cuba has heavily invested in its medical and pharmaceutical system, in part because of the 6-decade-old U.S. embargo that's made it harder for Cuba to import equipment and raw materials from other countries. In the 1980s, Cuba developed the world's first meningitis B vaccine. It's also developed important cancer drugs that are now being used in the United States and elsewhere. In a moment, we'll go to Havana. But first, I want to turn to an excerpt from the recent online documentary series, The War on Cuba, produced by Belly of the Beast, an independent media group in Cuba. One episode looks at Cuba's efforts to fight COVID-19 at home and abroad. It's narrated by the Cuban journalist Liz Oliva Hernandez.
Every morning, tens of thousands of doctors, nurses, and medical students take to the streets across Cuba. They are on the front lines of our fight against COVID. Talia Ruiz is a first-year medical student.
I don't feel afraid. If we are careful and take the necessary measures, we won't get infected. There are doctors who have faced the disease head on, and they haven't gotten sick. For example, my dad. Hi, Dad.
Talia's father, Juan Jesus, is a family doctor who works at a small clinic next to their home. In March, he joined a group of Cuban doctors on a medical mission to Lombardy, Italy. At the time, Lombardy was the global epicenter of the pandemic.
The number of cases overwhelmed the health system there. We helped the medical personnel who could no longer handle so many cases, and we saved some lives. As we walked to the farewell ceremony, from every home, people came out and applauded us. It was the best feeling I've had in my life. That's why you go on missions.
It wasn't the first time Juan Jesus risked his life far from home. He's part of the Henry Reeve Brigade, Cuba's medical special forces.
Henry Reeve was a soldier from the United States who fought for Cuba against the Spanish in the 1868 war. The brigade was formed in 2005. A hurricane called Katrina destroyed New Orleans. There was a huge number of deaths. Cuba offered to send 100 doctors to work alongside U.S. doctors. We were ready to go.
George W. Bush rejected Cuba's offer to help New Orleans. Since then, Juan Jesus has treated survivors of natural disasters and epidemics around the world.
Give me a minute here. I'm sorry.
We're going to go on to the second part of this.
Yeah, and this is. Forgive me. I'm trying to get rid of the screen share here.
It's okay. We're all enjoying this presentation and appreciate it.
Well,
Yeah, take your time, Emily.
Okay, don't panic, Emily. You're all being very kind and I appreciate it. Help. This is the trouble is I can't get at the thing because the it's hidden. There we go. Okay. We're getting there. We're getting there. Okay.
To bring journalist Reed Lindsay into this conversation, who has put out this series, founder of Belly of Beast, called The War on Cuba. If you can talk about overall during the time of COVID, even beyond the vaccines, what Cuba has done, what you document in your film series, like sending doctors to places like Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, and beyond.
Thanks a lot, Amy. I was in Haiti for 5 years, and that was my first direct experience with the Cuban doctors, and I found it remarkable what the Cuban program in Haiti was doing. It wasn't only bringing Cuban doctors to work in the forest areas of Haiti, it was also training Haitian doctors in Cuba. And Cuba at that time was graduating more doctors than the public universities in Haiti. And they were returning to Haiti and working there. And in a sense, it was brain drain in reverse. And living here in Cuba, my doctor is just a block or two away. If I have any problem, I walk down there. It's free. I don't have to show any papers. And that's what it's like for healthcare. It can be a little shocking not having to go in and fill out forms and showing your insurance and everything. And of course, when COVID hit, I knew that Cuba would be prepared, and I felt safer here, frankly, a lot safer than I did if I had been in the United States. I remember telling my mom, who's often been worried about different places I've been in around the world, I told her now I was more worried about her than she was about me.
I want to turn to another excerpt from your film, The War on Cuba, about Brazil's far-right President Jair Bolsonaro expelling thousands of Cuban doctors in 2018.
Bolsonaro has always followed the U.S. president. They call him the Latino Trump. The U.S. wants to cut off the income to choke the Cuban economy, to try to bring about a political change here on the island. When Cuba left the program, around 1,700 municipalities were suddenly left without doctors. I had a patient in Brazil, a 70-year-old man, illiterate. He made an appointment so he could say goodbye. He cried right here on my shoulder.
Millions of Brazilians in poor communities were left without health care. It was just the beginning. Ecuador's president became a Trump ally, and then, in November 2019, he expelled hundreds of Cuban doctors. That same month, a U.S.-supported coup ousted Bolivian President Evo Morales. Bolivia's de facto government immediately took aim at the Cuban doctors.
The false Cuban doctors. They said we weren't doctors. They accused us of being criminals.
Joandra Muro was head of the Cuban medical mission in Bolivia.
They threatened to burn down the Cuban doctors' homes. They took others to Interpol. They pointed guns at 2 brigade members. They strip searched some of our women.
That an excerpt from The War on Cuba. Reed Lindsay, a founder of the Belly of the Beast production that made this series. Now, this is very interesting what's happening in Brazil. And if you can talk about the effects of this. I mean, we just reported that 4,200 people died in Brazil just yesterday. That's over 10 times the number of Cubans who've died during the entire pandemic.
Yeah, it's and in doing this the series, we spoke with numerous doctors who were part of Cuban doctors who were in Brazil, and they were hurting because they knew that these communities that they were helping, they weren't able to help, and that they were suffering. People were dying of COVID. What that was part of Trump's policies to crush the Cuban economy, because Cuba sends doctors to other parts of the world. Like Haiti, there are many cases where there's really no evidence it's anything but altruistic. But it also sends doctors to places like Brazil, and Cuba receives some money for that, and they use that money to subsidize healthcare in Cuba. And so the Trump administration went after these programs to try to basically hurt the Cuban economy, and it wasn't the only thing they'd done. What's really remarkable about the vaccines And what Cuba's achieved in the last year is that Cuba right now is undergoing a severe economic crisis. And in part, it's because of COVID. Obviously, there's no more tourism, and Cuba depended greatly on tourism for its economy. But even before then, there were people who were comparing the economic situation in Cuba to the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union, which was considered worse than the Great Depression. And the reason was because of U.S. sanctions. Now, the embargo's been around for decades, but under Trump, those sanctions became far, far worse. And, that's really the story we were trying to tell with the war in Cuba. And I feel it's important to point out that this is a project. What's really unique about Belly of the Beast, and I'm very proud of being a part of it, is that it is a collaboration between U.S. journalists and filmmakers and Cuban journalists and filmmakers. Most of the people in Belly of the Beast are young Cuban journalists and filmmakers. They're telling stories about U.S. intervention in Cuba for a young audience in the United States. And we feel that's really important because people in the United States are at the forefront of pushing for change and policy in the U.S., but they don't always get information about the impact of U.S. policy in other parts of the world, such as Cuba. Not only how that policy is affecting Cubans, but also how that policy affects people in the U.S. And you cited an example earlier. Cuba produces life-saving drugs that cannot be obtained in the United States because of the U.S. embargo.
Let me go back to Dr. Rolando Perez Rodriguez. What plans does Cuba have for your vaccines, like Soberano? How do you plan to use it? And as with doctors, do you plan to export this vaccine? And how many people have participated in trials in Cuba?
Okay, we are expecting to get the result of the phase 3 clinical trial by June. So if we have already the clinical data for the efficacy of this vaccine, we should get an authorization for emergency use for the Cuban Regulatory Agency. And then we can start a massive immunization program in our country. But in parallel, with this phase 3 clinical trial that involves more than 80,000 people, because Soberana, a candidate vaccine, or vaccine candidate has a clinical trial that should include more than 44,000 people, and the other vaccine, candidate vaccine, Abdala, has a clinical trial that should include 48,000 volunteers. So, but in parallel to this clinical phase 3 clinical trial, we are also making clinical studies at population scale in risk groups, population group. For example, the healthcare workers, or people that are facing the disease directly. And then in this personal, medical, doctor, nurses, and employees, we are also now making a clinical study. All this data from phase 3 and the clinical data in this a population, a clinical study that is like a real work, because in that kind of study you will have not only the efficacy, but also how effective will be the vaccine in somehow stop the viral transmission, not just preventing the disease. We should have enough data by June to have this emergency use authorization from the Cuban Regulatory Agency.
I want to go to the U.S. I want to go to the U.S. administration approach to Cuba. During his campaign, President Biden promised to lift current restrictions on remittances and travel to Cuba, but it remains unclear if he's going to pursue resetting relationships with the island. Last month, White House spokesperson Jen Psaki said a shift in U.S. policy on Cuba is not a priority for Biden, adding his administration is reviewing Trump's designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. This is Biden speaking to a crowd in Broward County, Florida, just days before the 2020 presidential election.
We have to vote for new Cuba policy as well. This administration approach isn't working. Cuba's no closer to freedom and democracy today than it was 4 years ago. In fact, there are more political prisoners, and secret police are as brutal as ever. And Russia, once again, is a major presence in Havana.
So that was Biden right before the election. Of course, during the Obama-Biden years, they were normalizing relations with Cuba. Reed Brody, we're going to end with you. Reed Lindsay, we're going to end with you. If you can talk about what the effect of these U.S. sanctions has been on Cuba, and what it would mean if those sanctions were lifted.
And as mentioned, Cuba is going through an unbelievable economic crisis. And the sanctions have been absolutely devastating. And they've taken on every part of the Cuban economy. They blocked oil shipments from Venezuela. There was an energy crisis in Cuba. They blocked remittances. If you wanted to send me some money in Cuba, you wouldn't be able to do so. You no longer can send money via Western Union. They basically stopped all investment. They've called Cuba a state sponsor of terror. They stopped all U.S. tourism. Even if there wasn't COVID, there'd be no U.S. tourists coming here. Basically, Biden is, although he said that he was going to implement a new Cuban policy, has not shown that he will. And just yesterday, Juan Gonzalez, who's for the National Security Council that runs point on Latin American policy, told CNN, quote, Biden is not Obama in Cuba policy. And he said that that the administration would not invest the political capital necessary to change policy towards Cuba. The Biden administration is being pressured by powerful Cuban Americans. The Cuban Americans are the chairs of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They're getting a lot of pressure, and they're just not interested in changing policy. At least so far, they've shown them that. So far, it's status quo as far as policy towards Cuba.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Reed Lindsay, journalist and
Okay, we're running a bit late, but I hope you found that a powerful, and all the presentations powerful ones. I hope those words from Reed Lindsay in the end make you feel angry about what Cuba is achieving, has achieved, and what the US is doing to it. So I'm going to now talk 10 minutes or so about some things to do. And I'm still going to start by talking about our caravan to Cuba. I know some of you have been on it, others of you will have welcomed it, and we remember the days when we were taking still symbolic but significant amounts of humanitarian aid, medical, educational to Cuba on old school buses. For various reasons we won't go into right now, we can't do that anymore, but we are still taking people to Cuba, and we're taking modest amounts on flights of symbolic humanitarian aid. That's what we call our caravan. We've done 30 caravans. The 31st should have been last summer. Didn't happen because of COVID. Even as of 2 weeks ago, we were still hoping maybe we could go this summer in late July. Still not going to happen this summer because of COVID. Because basically Cuba can't allow large numbers of visitors on whatever basis into their country until they've got COVID under control, until the mass vaccination program, which is coming, has really been implemented. So we're now projecting we're going to go late October, early November. No guarantee, but we're fairly hopeful that that's a realistic timetable. So what is a caravan for those of you who haven't been on it? What is it? What would it be like? Basically, we spend 10 days in Cuba, but before that, we spend 2 days in an orientation process, which this year will be in the US, probably in Miami, where we gather together to prepare you for the caravan, and then we go to Cuba. Usually there for 10 days, maybe 11. We visit Havana, we stay in the Martin Luther King Center, which is linked to the Ebenezer Baptist Church. So we stay in a working class community in Havana. If you want luxury hotels, don't come with passes for peace. And we are there to learn about Cuba. In Havana, we go to another province. I'm not sure yet which one, but we go to the other province, particularly to see aspects of rural Cuba, not just to see the capital, which has its own dynamic, but is not necessarily typical of Cuba. And we're there to learn. Particularly this year, we'll be learning about Cuba's response to COVID, some of which you've just seen, but we'll be learning about other social programs. In the rural areas, we'll certainly be visiting organic agriculture projects. And we'll be learning about religion in Cuba. I mean, the IFCO is the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. It's not a Christian organization, it's an interreligious organization. But you don't have to be religious to come with us. Many people aren't. We take people of faith and conscience. That's our language. Of all faiths and none, but faith and conscience. But we want to learn about religion in Cuba in its various aspects. Jewish, Islamic, as well as Christian. Because when you come back, if you come with us, when people tell you there is no religious freedom in Cuba, we want you to be able to say, well, I just saw it in action. I witnessed it, because it's a lie that there's no religious freedom in Cuba. We go as highly honoured guests because of 30 years of campaigning in the most difficult years in support of Cuba. We are special. That means we get to see people like, we get to meet university deans or directors of hospitals. Last time it went, we arrived, and at the airport we were told, this evening you're meeting the president of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel. And he said, next time you come, we're going to meet you again. I don't make that a guarantee. He's a very busy man, but it could well happen. But we meet other special people. We meet what most people would say were ordinary Cubans. Informally, formally, I don't want to call them ordinary Cubans. I want to call them extraordinary Cubans. We get to meet them. And we learn. We don't do volunteer work. Last time we did 2 hours of planting seeds, symbolic volunteer work. But people ask me, what work do you do in Cuba? And I say, we learned about Cuba. And the work we do is what happens when we come back. What does it cost? Last time, $1,650. We'll be about that this year, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. We offer some scholarships for people because we want young people to come with low income. We don't offer full scholarships. We offer some scholarship. And then we work with young people or older people who like money, encourage them and about how they could raise the money to meet their share of the cost. That's the Caravan. And if you want to ask more questions later, that's fine. One other place we visit is the Latin American Medical School in Havana. It's an incredible place. It's the largest medical school in the world. Something like 10,000 students housed there from all the economically poor countries of the world. Some there on scholarships for free from the Cuban government, some there paid by their government. And we'll meet US students who are there because back in 2000, a delegation of the Black Congressional Caucus went with IFCO to meet with President Castro. And they asked about whether he could send Cuban doctors to the US. And he said, we'd love to, but your State Department wouldn't let us. Why don't we train your young people? Why don't you send your young people to us to learn to be doctors, Cuban-style doctors? And ever since, there's been a small scholarship program administered by IFCO, whereby young people from the US, from poor communities, often people of color, sometimes white, go to Cuba on a full scholarship. The only condition is that they must come back and go back to their communities, whether it be the Mississippi Delta or the meanest streets of New York or Chicago, and work as doctors, primary care doctors or other doctors, because they can work there because they're not $200,000 in debt, and they can work on the lower wages that family doctors get. So we administer that program. It's for young people, preferably under 25. Sometimes people 26, 27, 28 can maybe get in under the wire, but they've got to be young. They've got to meet the prerequisites for medical school. Any young people on this call, if you're interested in meet the age requirements, meet the prerequisites, think about the ELAM program. For the older folk on the call, think about young people you know in your community where you work. Could they benefit from this? It's not easy. It's medical school. That's never easy, but this is medical school in Spanish. If you've got Spanish already, fine. If you haven't, you have to go 6 months early to learn Spanish. And you're in college dorms. And if you're in your mid-20s, late 20s, being in college dorms is tough. You're in a poorer society. It's hard. We make no pretense about that. But people do it. We've had 200 people already graduate from that school. There's 60 there currently. We aim to send 10 to 15 every year. We're recruiting now for next February. I mean, the decision point will probably be in October, but we're recruiting to send more people next February. So think about looking for young people in your community who could go. And despite the fact that it's hard, I've met many of these young people who've come back from Cuba. They're not just amazing doctors, they're amazing people. That's what 6 years in Cuba has done for them. Pastors for Peace. We don't always emphasize as much as we could at the faith side, but I want to give Paul Asol, who's from Ashland, participating tonight, just a couple of minutes to talk about that side.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I've been meeting with the faith group lately just to think about how we can provide resources for people of faith to organize together and what might be effective. So Emily, can you say how these are going to be available to people? Can they access them on the website of IFCO, or they will be able to soon?
Yeah, we're developing a toolkit, and that's what Paul is talking about, of resource materials for you to use to talk to congregations in your community or your own. And right at the moment, we'll have a link that we can send you that will have all this material.
Okay.
IFCO's in the middle of getting a brand new website. So when we get a new one, it'll be on the website, but now it'll be a link.
Okay, that's what I wasn't clear about. So I'll just read a little short introduction to this link and the resource packet that you'll find there. But we said, to our sisters and brothers who join us in the search for earth as it is in heaven, people of many faiths agree that a better world is possible, and our siblings in Cuba are remarkable for their struggle in making a way out of no way to bring that world into being. Although they continue to suffer under the harsh blockade imposed by the US government, they are partners in our shared struggle for what our faith assures us is possible. Their commitment to healthcare, education, housing, and provision of basic needs is instructive for us. Since the revolution, people of faith in the US who have understood the values of the revolution to be consistent with their faith have supported Cuba. Strategies have included political advocacy, travel, congregational partnerships, delivery of aid, and more. So this packet includes ideas and resources for faith groups to encourage their organizing efforts for justice for Cuba. So one of the things we have here is a sample letter that you might send to your representatives and congresspeople. We, Merkley and Wyden are actually sponsors of this current bill. It's called the US-Cuba Trade Act of 2021. And it's meant to repeal the outdated sanctions on Cuba and establish normal trade relations. So Wyden and Merkley are co-sponsors of it. So one thing we would like to do is thank them for that, for being sponsors, and also to invite them to look for colleagues on the House of Representatives that might bring out a similar bill to the House. So there's some sample letters for that, and you could share with other friends that you know. One of my ideas was just to send this out to my clergy colleagues throughout the state and ask them to do a sign-on letter, and hopefully we can do that, use that model in other states as well, just so that they know that there's broad support for Cuba freedom. Another thing that you'll find in this packet is several links to what different denominations have work they've already done in setting out their statements about their Cuba policy and support. So you'll see several links that are coming in that email that you can refer to see what any faith group that you might be a part of is already doing, or to share it with other people that you think might have an interest in making those connections.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. That was great. I put in the chat some links to our website, www.ifconews.org. If you want to find out more detail about med school, go to that website. Gives a lot of detail about the medical school. If you want to ask us about different things, the Caravan, that long address, friendshipcaravan@ifconews.org is my address. ifco@ifconews.org is Emily's address. And to ask me about the Caravan, write to me. To ask about the Faith in Action Initiative, Emily. Or you can write to either of us and we'll forward it on to the other. But I just want to come back to what Paula was saying about Wyden and Merkley. I see Jack Herbert from Portland has joined us. I remember Jack and I 2 or 3 years ago went to visit one of the senior aides of Ron Wyden. I don't know whether we made an impact on him, but it's great what Ron Wyden has done in introducing this bill. I would encourage a delegation from Oregon to go back to Wyden's office in person. You probably won't meet him, you meet an aide, but thank them. But as Paula said, it's really important that they get somebody in the House, one of their Democratic colleagues, to introduce an identical bill. Push them on that. There are other bills coming. We know that, not yet, but there's going to be bills coming, a bill coming on travel to Cuba. A 1-paragraph bill, House and Senate, that basically says US citizens can go freely to Cuba without restriction. That's been introduced before. It's never got voted upon. It's going to be introduced again. We know that from the past that Wyden and Merkley will support it, no doubt. Your members of Congress, the House, I don't know. I don't know who they are. You know who they are. You know what they're like. They're probably a mixed bag, I suspect. But when that travel bill comes out, knock on their doors, talk to their aides, get them to sign on to the travel bill, get them to sign on to the Trade Act when if and when it's introduced. So congressional advocacy is important. I think I want to now talk about money, because I want to make sure I talk about money before some of you leave. That's not an invite to leave suddenly. And then when I've done that, it's open for questions to go on as long as we want. Emily's put up the slide about ways to donate. But before I talk about ways to donate, I want to talk about why donate. Or rather, I think we've made the case about why IFCO work is important. But people will ask, well, if we donate money, what's it going for? It will go into the IFCO bank account, but what it might go for is many things. That when we travel to Cuba, we will be taking medical aid with us. Hopefully that'll be syringes, it'll be gloves, it'll be PPE. Hopefully we'll have got it all donated. We won't have to actually purchase it, but it will cost us to fly it out, not just in people's personal bags, but in a negotiated taking of aid in the plane as cargo. That will cost money. We want to offer scholarships, not full scholarships, but partial scholarships to young people to take them to Cuba. We need more young people, and especially young people of color, to be going to Cuba, and they can't afford it. So we want to offer partial scholarships to enable them to. That costs money. The medical students, their education is free, but IFCO has to do a lot of supporting of them in the process of getting them to apply, supporting them when they're in Cuba, supporting them when they come back to get into residency programs in this country. That costs a lot of staff time, a lot. We wish we could do more. We need money to be able to do that, and more effectively. And in general, we want money for political campaigning. I'm very upfront about that. We get no money from government. We get no money from business. We don't get very much money from trusts because we deal with Cuba. So that's controversial. We rely on people like you and events like this to raise money. So that's why you should donate to Cuba, us, IFCO. How much? If I was doing this in person, as I have done in Corvallis and Portland and Ashland in the past, I'd be asking you to put money into a hat, and I'd be collecting it up afterwards, and there'd be dollars and $5 and $10 and $20, usually a lot of $20, and maybe $50 or a check for 100 or a check for 200. We've even had, not often, but even had occasionally a check for $1,000. I know that some of you, maybe in this COVID crisis, have been suffering badly economically. I don't want your money. You need it for yourself. But if you haven't been suffering badly economically, and many of us haven't because of jobs or because of pensions, think seriously about donating to IFCO and be as generous as you possibly can. This blockade has lasted 60 years. I've been doing this in Britain and the US for 30 years. I'm 68 now. I don't want to be doing it for another 30 years, even though I would like to live to 98. Despite that Biden has been a real disappointment so far, we still think that there is an opportunity this year, these years, with a Democrat president, with the Democrat Congress, Democrat Senate, to make progress, to make headway. We want to really, if not ending it, knock big holes in the blockade this year, next year. And that's why we need to do campaigning. And that's why we need money. And that's why I want you to be generous. You can donate in many ways. You can't put your hands in your pocket to get money, but you can put your hands in your pocket and get out your cell phone, literally. And dial that number, 646-859-5344, and text the word Oregon, just for you. And you'll get the instructions to pay by credit card online. Well, you can go to your website, www.ifconews.org. Click on the donate button. I think there's several donate buttons on the website, and pay by credit card. Or you can send us a check made out to IFCO, just IFCO, and mail it to that address, which is not, you could mail it to our New York office, but it'll get there quicker in this time of COVID if you mail it to that address, which is next to where our director, Gail Walker, lives. But please don't write the word Cuba anywhere on the check, because although our bank, Amalgamated Bank, is a progressive bank, there is a program on our account installed by the US Treasury, which basically says that anything that says Cuba will be confiscated. That's the tentacles of the economic blockade. So if you send us a check that says donation for the Friendship and Caravan to Cuba, we'll send it you back and say, please change it. All donations are tax deductible. So that's how you can donate. And the final thing I want to say in this is, if you're thinking about what you're going to donate and you've already decided in your mind or have a good idea, shout about it. Write it in the chat. Make a pledge, which even if you're going to fulfill later by a website or by check, make the pledge now and put it in the chat. And let's get a ball rolling on this. Okay, that's it. Open for questions. Can you stop screen sharing, Emily?
Thank you, Malawa.
First donation. Keep them going. Okay.
Michael,
questions. I mean, we've got one question we've got one question that's been there for quite a while, so I'm going to address that now. But if you've got questions, and we do want to take questions, and they can be hard questions, difficult questions.
Unmute yourself so that you can ask them if you want.
Yeah. I mean, You can either put the question in the chat or, so Malaya, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, sure. So do you feel like national unity and also the culture there in Cuba contributes to the success of campaigns to address COVID-19 and other issues in the country? How can we learn from this here in the US?
Quite a question. Thank you. Undoubtedly, the national unity of the Cuban people, which is not absolute and perfect, but has a lot of strength to it. That enables them to, in difficult circumstances, social distancing is really hard in Cuba. They have their accommodation, but it's often overcrowded. Because of food shortages, they have to go at times to, there's a ration card system. They have to go and get food on the ration card, and they have to queue up for quite a while. That's part of the reality of Cuba. That makes following COVID restrictions hard, but they're doing it as best they can because of that strength of national unity and because of their faith in their health service, and because over 60 years of Cuban Revolution, it's not just that the government says this and the government says that, although the government plays a very strong role, but a collective consciousness has developed based undoubtedly on historic sense of Cuban family, but a communal consciousness. And so people respond to what the government says about how to fight COVID in a way that so many people in this country, particularly in the more Republican areas, do not. So yes, that's a profound lesson. What we do about it in this country is a big issue, and I don't claim to be the expert on that at all. This is a political battle we're all having to fight. But looks, Mike, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, one of the primary things we need to do in the United States, not just for COVID, but for the well-being of people in this country, is to have some sort of universal health care. Now, I don't think we can have a public health service like they've had in England, but many of us are supporters of a single payer system in the US. And I think if we had this kind of guaranteed access to healthcare, I think that would be a big start towards developing the sense that we are in this together, and that we have a government which isn't our enemy, but which is actually here to make life better for us. And so I think that's, achieving single payer healthcare, some form of universal access to good quality healthcare is essential in the United States. And that's, and many of us on this call are working for that as well. It's not a new idea, but it's something, it would be a step towards trying to develop that communal consciousness where we have responsibility for each other.
Well said, Mike. How I wish this country had national health service. Part of makes me think, I have family here, I'm married, I am staying here, but the thought of not having access to free healthcare, it's just crazy. Okay. If you've got a question, just raise your hand. If you know how to do it via Zoom, raise your hand via Zoom. If you're not sure, just stick your hand up anyhow. So, Malaya, you got another question?
Yeah, it's not exactly a question, but it's just something I was thinking about during this presentation, and also thinking about like national unity, is that I think there's definitely a lot of division right now here in the United States. And one of the issues is that, so obviously, like a country like Cuba, there are different kinds of Cubans, right? Like in Cuba, there are like Cubans who are like Black Cubans, right? And then there are like Cubans who have more like European ancestry. And then there are also like Cubans who are more of like, that are Black, and they have like African ancestry, like Indigenous and European. And I've never been to Cuba before, so I don't know really what it's like there. But it seems like one of the problems in the United States is that not all Americans are seen and treated as Americans. And I think that's like a really big impediment to national unity. Like with this like recent like increase in anti-Asian racism and violence, for example, like a lot of Asian Americans who are even born in the US are like being yelled at and told to go back to their country. And even though they're American. And so, so like, yeah, I was wondering if you had something to say about that. I haven't traveled that much, but when I was in Mexico, I did notice that like there's a lot of diversity also in Mexico. And in general, Mexicans, no matter what their race is, they're all considered Mexican as well.
Good question, a good comment. I mean, I agree with Malaya with what you just said about the United States, but to comment on Cuba, and Cuba is a vast mixture of people from Spain. So in this country, they might be called Latino, but they're really white in terms of Cuban thinking. People who came as slaves from Africa, remnants of the indigenous population, and also quite a lot of Chinese who came as, once slavery was abolished, they came as almost slave workers. And a lot of intermarriage, a lot of intermingling. So it's a very complex racial mix. But before the revolution, massive discrimination against people of color in Cuba, massive. And the revolution started a process of changing that. It's been an ongoing struggle, and they removed very quickly the institutional racism within the society to enable Black people to have the same opportunities as Black Cubans, same as white Cubans. But kind of cultural racism, that takes, as they've discovered, it doesn't take even just decades, it takes a very long time. It's an ongoing struggle. One of the things when we go to Cuba is we get people being very honest with us. In the last Caravan, we met with members of what's called the Aponte Commission, which has been to look into and come up with strategies for dealing with ongoing race issues in Cuba. And they talked proudly about their achievements, but they talked about their difficulties. And for instance, they talked about the curriculum and how the school curriculum was too much about white Cuban history and not enough about Black Cuban history of Africa. And they came up with a whole series of recommendations to change that. And the government accepted the recommendations in their totality. And they said, the next struggle is the teachers. We've got a lot of teachers with old ways of thinking. They're not necessarily being racist, but they just have biases towards teaching white history. We've got to challenge that. So they're very honest about Cuba has made a great advances. But they're still working on it. But it's so different a society from here. And yeah, one more thing that the US can learn from, and why we want people to go to Cuba, learn from it, but learn from it as a real society, with its problems, with its challenges, with its mistakes, and its tremendous achievements.
Can I just add one thing that's different between Cuba and here is the amount of violence. In Cuba, I remember one time I was looking for some friend's house and I got off at the wrong bus stop and I'm wandering around at about midnight at night by myself, barely speak Spanish, felt perfectly safe. And somebody came and showed me where to go. And I wouldn't have done that in the States. I wouldn't have felt comfortable. But the level of violence from police, from each other, within homes, it's not a perfect society, but it's a big difference one from here.
Good idea, Malaya. You said you've never been to Cuba. What about coming to Cuba with us in this caravan? If you're interested.
I'd love to.
All right.
Okay.
Let's talk about making it happen.
Yeah. I mean, from your registration, I will have your email address, and I put in the chat mine. Let's start talking.
Sure. I'm also fully vaccinated.
Good.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know yet, but we imagine that the our Cuban partners will insist that people who come on our caravan in November are fully vaccinated. It's going to be their decision, but that's the decision I expect, and we will implement that. So, just to say. Okay. Other questions?
I want to just say thank you so much for your presentation tonight. I think Alita has chatted with me about many of these things, and I'm just glad this email came to me. I would probably like to do a caravan, and we'll plan to donate.
Sorry, who was that?
That was Carolyn Hines.
Carolyn Hines. Okay. Right. I'll write to you about the caravan as well.
Yeah. Alita and I have been buddies for a long time. I'll talk with her more about it all.
Yeah.
Yes, we will. Yes, we will.
I'm just looking at Marianne Jones in my screen. And Marianne is testament that, I mean, I think it was, when did you last come on the caravan? Was it 10 years ago or?
Yeah, it was 2011.
Yeah, okay. Can you say it are you happy to tell people your age when you came on the caravan?
In 2011?
Yeah.
Let me think. I was 80.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. We take people of all ages. And as long as you're healthy enough to take a fairly hectic program, we'll take you. If we have concerns about you in your application, we'll raise them. But we've had people bring young children. It's all ages. All we ask is that if you're an adult or a young adult, that you come with a commitment to learning about Cuba, and being prepared to come back and work against the blockade.
I also would like to say it is a wonderful, eye-opening, mind-changing experience. And I wish everybody in this country who wants to learn about Cuba would actually or could actually go there, because and I would love to go again, but I don't think I will be able to because of my age. But please, if you can't go, encourage your family members or friends to go, because it's worth every penny that you might spend to do that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
What is the age that you allow children to go?
Well, if they're coming with their parents, we've had very young children come. I mean, that's something for the parents to think about, because obviously, if you've got a very young child, it obviously limits your participation to some extent. But when it's two parents and they've shared the childcare, that's worked. So we leave that to the parents. If it's a young person, like 14, 15, we would prefer they came with a parent, but we've had situations where they've come with another family member, or we've had somebody who's come as their legal guardian. We can't allow a 14, 15-year-old to come completely unaccompanied.
No. Well, I was thinking of myself as the grandparent. with one of my grandchildren.
Definitely, we've had people do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Carol, you've raised your hand.
I'm just wondering when you will do this presentation again. Like, how often do you do this kind of presentation?
We're doing these. The aim is to do quite a lot of these over the next 2 to 3 months. Oregon is number one. Oregon takes the lead. We're aiming to do, in some places where it's a big city, we'll do it just for that city. In other states, we'll do it for North Carolina, for Virginia, for whatever.
Okay.
The target is probably to do 25 of these presentations over the coming months. And we will always aim to primarily publicize it in the States because we want to get a local audience. We know people can join it from anywhere else if they want to, but we really want to focus on local audiences.
Can I go to your website to get the link and when the next one would be?
Yeah, and that will be going up. I mean, literally, this is the first. We're going to be in upstate New York. And in fact, Mike got this early. We weren't planning to do any till May, but Mike said, because of Open OSU and their Earth Week, please come to Oregon on April 20th. So the next definite one is in upstate New York on May the 5th. But a program will develop, and as we get the dates and the bookings and the links, we'll put them on the website.
Okay.
But more late May, June, early July.
Also, in fact, unless you ask me not to, I'm going to put people's emails on our list. So if you've been getting emails from us, you'll continue just like you were. And if you haven't been, you'll start getting, we do a Cuba buzz with information about Cuba and from Cuba every week. And then information about similar webinars and other events that are happening that are national, as well as these local ones that you're asking about. So it's not, we don't overwhelm, we try not to overwhelm you. You're not going to get 5 emails a day or even probably 5 a week, but you will be getting some emails to keep you in the loop.
Yeah. But if you've got a friend, say in Albuquerque, New Mexico, I say Albuquerque because there will be an event for Albuquerque in June. The way to find out about that is to just look at our website later in May, and then you'll be able to find out about that and other places as well. Malaya, you want another question?
Oh, well, in one of the videos that that you all showed, there was some mention of one of the reasons why I guess like Biden is sort of like leaning towards like not improving Cuban-US relations is because he's influenced by Cuban American voters in the US, I think in like Florida or something. And so so maybe like it sounds like, well, it sounds kind of terrible because it sounds like to me like Cuban Americans are not kind of like they're not, it sounds like they're not thinking about how this these sanctions, economic sanctions, are affecting their fellow Cubans, even though these other Cubans are not, they're still living in Cuba. I don't know if that makes sense, because they're all like one people, you know. So like it doesn't make sense for their political views, for them to let their political views allow their other fellow Cubans to suffer. And so like maybe part of this solution would be for some people to do like some kind of like dialogue with Cuban Americans.
Okay, that's a great question, and it allows me to say something I wanted to say but I hadn't got around to. So let me answer the question. First of all, when Obama was promoting moderately reasonable policies towards Cuba, he won Florida both times. And at that point, something like 55 to 60% of Cuban Americans were saying they wanted normal relations with Cuba. They wanted the blockade to end. Trump he was providing some level of leadership. Trump turned that around. Trump attacked Cuba nonstop. And he didn't just attack Cuba. He said, Cuba is an example of socialism, communism. The Democrats want to introduce socialism, communism in the United States. Vote for me. Even so, 40% of Cuban Americans in Miami voted for Biden. And they voted for Biden for a mix of reasons, but probably part of it was they want to help their families in Cuba. They want to visit their families in Cuba. They want normal relations. They want to end the blockade. And Biden at the moment is letting them down, but they're not all just sitting back. There are petitions out there being done by Cuban Americans urging Biden to end the blockade. And I want to talk about not our caravan, but car caravans. And this is something you may want to think about in Portland and Corvallis and Ashland. It started in Miami with one Cuban American angry at what was happening and doing a bicycle protest. It has now become in Miami something like 50 vehicles the last Sunday of every month. 50 vehicles, quite a lot of bikes, driving through Miami, protesting the blockade. It started in Miami. It spread to Seattle and Los Angeles. Seattle, we have in Seattle a Cuban American school teacher, Carlos Lazo, who has become very prominent in campaigning against the blockade. I'm going to put in the chat in a minute his website, Puentes de Amor, Building Bridges of Love with Cuba. Very much our language, Building Bridges of Love with Cuba. And so these car caravans are now happening. In March, they happened in 15 US cities, 7 Canadian cities, 50 to 100 cities around the world, picking up on a Cuban American initiative. Obviously, many people involved who aren't Cuban Americans, but picking up on a Cuban American initiative and starting to give voice to a community where there are many voices who are opposed to the blockade, but have always lived in obeisance and often at times in fear of the most reactionary elements of the Cuban American community in Miami. So this is really important. In Seattle, our car caravan is 20 cars, 30 people. It can feel like, well, what's 20 cars and 30 people? What, with placards and slogans and a picket driving around, gonna do? But we're not just one place. We're part of an international movement, and that's growing. And as I say, it's really important because it began with Cuban Americans, and we want to support them and to get them to raise their voices in protest to Biden ever louder. So thank you for that question. I'm just going to put Carlos Lazo's website in the chat. Oops. It's there. Carlos Lazo fled Cuba. He uses those words. He fled Cuba 30 years ago to be reunited with his mother. His father didn't come. His father was a supporter of the revolution, is a supporter of the revolution. And when he came to the US and Miami, his views about Cuba started to change because he discovered how reactionary and how vile some of the stuff going on in Miami is. And it made him rethink his own attitude to his country. He's now a leading advocate for normal relations with Cuba. Check out that website. It's in Spanish and it's partly in English. And yeah. but Portland, Corvallis, Ashland, and think about a car caravan. I mean, if you want to talk more about that, email me. It's not for everywhere, but it might be something that if you want to stand up in public and raise a voice, something you could do. Any other questions? I know numbers are dwindling, and I don't mind staying on, but if people feel it's time to end, that's okay. Jack.
I wonder, is there documented, written up evidence about how they do elections and who's allowed to run in Cuba, and how people at the grassroots give direction to the government or exercise it? I mean, like here, we just elect representatives and they do whatever they do. Is there any power given at the grassroots level for people? And in Oregon as a state, we can pass ballot measures. But anyhow, is there anything? And I mean, like in Venezuela, they talk about neighborhood community groups that I'm not quite sure how it works, but give direction to the legislature and the executive.
Okay.
Is there a place where we can?
Yeah.
Written like
in the North American continent, the person to go to as the expert is a man called Arnold August. He's Canadian, Quebecois from Montreal. Google his name, Arnold August and Cuba, and you'll find his writings and his books about democracy in Cuba.
Great.
He can be a bit academic, but it's still an important document of, but I want to say a bit more than just saying go to Arnold August.
Arnold August in Canada about Cuba.
Quebec. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. That it's one of the lies that there are no elections in Cuba. There is an electoral system. It's very different from here. It's based on, it's a no-party system. People stand a bit like the way maybe some small councils in the US would run, or in Britain. People run as individuals on their individual merits. There's no money involved. There's no kind of conventional campaigning, and you have to live in the neighborhood you're running for. It's a different kind of system. We could debate for hours actually about the pros and cons of it, but it's different and it exists. And it's all about building up from the base, local representatives who elect national representatives, and maintaining national unity. In addition, there are various mass organizations in Cuba. There are the neighborhood organizations, the committees for the defense of the revolution, which are block by block based organizations which have an impact on policy. That I've attended a routine, what's called the rendering of accounts meeting, where the people from that block ask various officials, ask their elected official, but also officials from the local government to come and answer questions, a bit like a town hall. So that happens. There's other mass organizations. There's the trade unions, there's the Women's Federation, there's the young people's organizations. They all have an impact on policy. So that is not, when the US says there's no democracy in Cuba, well, is there how strong is democracy in this country?
How do these different organizations have an impact? It's not a formal, so many votes impact, is it?
Yeah, they have, these various organizations have representatives in the popular power.
Oh.
As the women's group, the labor unions.
So some of them are, some of the elected people in the legislature are elected geographically, like here, and some of them are elected from these different groups, the women's.
Right.
Various groups that are maybe discriminated against have special representation.
Well, they're more the Women's Federation, the farmers, they're more either who you are or your occupation.
Yeah. And so there will be clergy in the national parliament. There will be young people as young as 25 in the national parliament. And the parliament, in this process, the aim is to reach 50-50 men, women. They're almost there. I think it's something like 48% women. And to reflect the racial diversity of the Cuban population, so that whilst there aren't people who are elected specifically from Afro-Cuban organizations, Afro-Cubans are in the parliament on the levels that are commensurate with their weight in the population. So it's way in advance of the US in terms of gender diversity and racial diversity.
Partly by encouraging, maybe they encourage people to, like, if you're short of African Cubans, then you say, come on, some more of you need to run and get elected.
At one point, there were a lot of criticism that they were short of Afro-Cubans. And because of that criticism, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of, come on and get elected.
Yeah.
It's been a process, as they were talking. I mean, there's racism in Cuba, just like no, it's not just like it is here. It's quite different, but it exists.
Yeah.
But it's quite different in here.
I want to come back to something Malaya said earlier about, for this country, about national unity. That the Cuban system is about facing an external threat from the most powerful neighbor in the world, 90 miles away. Its whole system is designed to build national unity. It's designed not just to have the kind of bitter political divides and faction fights that happen here. It's about debate and discussion and trying to achieve consensus, or at the very least, achieving results that most people are okay with. And that's how it's structured. So its structure is very different from here. Mike, as the person who invited us on, do you feel we've been on long enough, or do you want to carry on?
I kind of feel we're, well, I think I've had enough fun. I'm ready to leave. My computer was running out of juice. I had to go plug it in, so that's why I changed locations. But I kept hoping that we would finish before we ran out of power here, but we didn't quite make it. Anyway, so yeah, I really appreciate everybody who participated tonight in this, and I know I probably talked longer than I should have, but I hope I wasn't completely boring. At least you found it.
No, you weren't.
And anyway, I really recommend people who have the time find the opportunity to go to Cuba with Pastors for Peace. I think that's the big obstacle for people generally, is finding the time to do it. The expense is not that great, and there are people who can help with the expense if you can't afford it. But if you've got the time, spend some of that time going to Cuba.
Thank you so much. It's been very informative. Thank you.
Can I say one small thing? Usually we go in July. Cuban July is hot. Cuban October is wonderful.
Okay, thank you, Mike and Alita, and everybody else from Oregon for having us. And as I said, once again, Oregon leads the way.
Thank you all for being here. It's been good to see folks I know.
Thank you.
New people.
I want
Check
to
out.
thank Mike. I thought your approach.
Bye-bye.
Hello to Marianne Jones from Sharon Levin. Okay, bye.
Okay, Emily, you could stop the recording, but I'm gonna save the chat, and you can save the chat as well.
Okay, I just saved the chat.